Hi there and welcome to part 2 of my deep dive into the judge's summing up at the end of Miss Letby's original trial. As stated in the first video, I'm going to pick things up on Monday 3rd July, where he resumes after the closing statements, having spent one day, June the 15th, giving legal directions to the jurors just before they heard the two closing statements. The judge began the day with evidence from the plumber, covering it in two fairly short sentences before adding a third, whose only purpose can have been to indicate to jurors that for him as the judge, the information given by the plumber was of no evidential significance. I quote report. The Women's and Children's Building was built in the 1960s and there were issues with the plumbing, and there was an incident between 2015-2016 where the hand basin backed up with foul water. There was another incident where room 4's floor flooded after a backup sink overflowed. None of the incidents reported happened on the days when alleged offences took place. End report quote. In his reminder of this evidence, he therefore gives the jurors the impression that the total number of incidents in the relevant period was 2 only, and scandalously encouraged them to see the possible health impact on sickly, premature babies of raw sewage in their physical environment as something which would manifest immediately or not at all. You may ask, just how stupid did he think the jurors were? That certainly would have been the takeaway had this not ended in a conviction. It would have been a gift that kept on giving as a source of cheap laughs. We're obviously not laughing though, as he somehow carried it off. Perhaps though, the statement wasn't to convince anyone, but was a signal to someone planted on that jury to entertain no nonsense about this foul water thing being a factor in the deaths and collapses, by firmly steering discussions in another direction when such a prospect showed on the horizon. Some of you will balk at the suggestion of a plant among the jurors to manage their discussions. You forget that in life, if an action is possible to secure a desired objective, people will generally do it, and unscrupulous people will always do it. That is what the word means, without scruple. Nothing is off limits in pursuit of the objective. If you are going to handpick a judge to engineer a conviction, which manifestly happened, why would you suddenly find a conscience at the idea of putting a wolf in among the sheep? More accurately, a sheepdog, to guide them down the road to nowhere millions had been wasted constructing because some fool up in Cheshire Constabulary took their eye off the ball back in 2017. The recognised need for such guidance might be the reason jurors were not allowed to speak about the case unless all were present. There is also the secrecy lockdown of their perpetual anonymity, an absence of any record of their discussions, and a legal prohibition on them ever speaking of those discussions. As a bureaucratic conspirator, what's not to like? Lorenzo Mansutti, the derided plumber, had in fact told the court that across the building Goss explicitly refers to, comprising the maternity unit and the neonatal unit, his staff were called to deal with sanitation issues associated with antiquated cast iron piping, which caused these issues by cracking through expansion, contraction, or simply age on a weekly basis. In questioning Lorenzo Mansutti, who appears to have been in charge of the plumbing unit, Ben Myers, while making it clear that the same pipes served at both the maternity unit and the neonatal unit did not highlight that the level of human traffic between the two, nurses, doctors, parents, and of course the babies themselves, meant that in potential impact on the health of the babies in the unit, no distinction can be made between sewage emerging in the maternity unit and emerging within the neonatal unit itself. Medical staff necessarily spent their shifts shuttling between the two places. If a contaminated surface is touched in the maternity unit, that contamination is coming back to the neonatal unit. Ben Myers did, however, take the time to make it clear to jurors that foul water is a generic term in plumbing covering everything from the water that runs down the plug hole when you wash your hands to feces flushed down the toilet. Foul water is therefore one of the stronger euphemisms around, which is precisely why Ben Myers felt the need to make explicit the fact that it covers human waste. I think a summing up of Mr. Mansutti's evidence had to also include that reminder. In her own testimony, Miss Letby gave the following evidence. I quote, "We used to have raw sewage coming out of the sinks and coming out onto the floor in nursery 1, end quote. That evidence from Miss Letby was not rebutted by the prosecution. They did not even challenge it. Why then is it not represented in this judge's summing up to the jurors on the question of foul water as a fact in the case? There is really no excuse, is there? There can only be one explanation for Miss Letby's uncontested evidence in this regard not making the cut for his summing up, and it is pretty obvious. I fully appreciate that you are viewing this video for information and insight into the judge's summing up, but I cannot do the matter of Miss Letby's primary defense justice without saying something further on it. The sanitation issue, after all, in and of itself, should have constituted a reasonable doubt. The first thing to say in that respect is this. In a previous video, I made comments supportive of Countess of Chester NHS Trust Chief Executive Tony Chambers for his handling of the initial witch hunt, but I am now obliged to revise that opinion because of the suppression of a document on the sewage issue. There is in existence a high-risk report on the neonatal unit dated May 20th, 2015. The report concerns Pseudomonas being found on 2 taps in the unit. This report was kept back from the police investigation. I cannot conceive of the chief executive being unaware of Pseudomonas in the neonatal unit. Therefore, even if somehow it wasn't his decision to keep it back, the buck has to stop with him for the report being kept secret. The significance of the report to Miss Letby's case couldn't really be greater. Pseudomonas causes sepsis, the condition where the body's immune system goes into overdrive, attacking its own organs, causing pneumonia where the lungs are concerned. The spike in deaths started just over 2 weeks after the report, and the medical file of all of Miss Letby's alleged first 3 murder victims included evidence of sepsis. Child A was being given medication for sepsis. Child C's notes show suspected sepsis, and Child D's post-mortem showed pneumonia. There is even a non-indictment child, Jacob, born within days of Child A's death, who got sepsis. He then went to another hospital and recovered, then came back to the Countess and got sepsis a second time. This is all in June 2015 when this all started. Given the direct chain connecting raw sewage, Pseudomonas and sepsis, the only option for dealing with that report, that high-risk report, for the individuals on the project to convict a nurse for the deaths was to suppress it. Even a judge as corrupt as James Goss would have struggled to justify excluding it from evidence, given that the only defense witness was going to be evidencing the contamination of the unit with raw sewage. As a final point, that high-risk report had to have been written by medical staff. It was either medical staff or the plumber who actually did the replacement of the tap in Nursery 1, the tap which then grew Pseudomonas when sent off to some lab for analysis. Sending replacement taps away for microbiological analysis is not part of a plumber's remit, even one working in a hospital. He certainly would not have been able to make head or tail of the returned Pseudomonas finding. Having gotten that out of the way, who might have an interest in knowing what bacteria is present on a tap in the neonatal unit? Nurses obviously have a professional interest, but it would surely be the medical staff in charge of that unit or their bosses, the trust itself, for whom such information would be most pertinent, right? And the trust would naturally delegate such a task to the medical staff anyway, as that is what they are there for, and they are the professionals. Any way you look at the genesis of the May 20th, 2015 high-risk report, both initiation and authorship come back to head of the neonatal unit, Stephen Brearey, and his team of 6 other consultants. On further reflection then, it is even possible that it could have been done without Tony Chambers' knowledge. Why then have we not heard of some inquiry by the police or the General Medical Council as to how a team of consultants whose only investigation just prior to the spike in deaths revealed the presence of a deadly sepsis-causing bacteria could, in good faith, petition the police to investigate a junior nurse for criminal liability for those deaths, especially where all 3 of the first of those deaths give medical evidence of sepsis. We can only hope that Cheshire Constabulary have made this high-risk report, with all its implications, part of the upgrade to their inquiry into hospital management. If they haven't, which doubtless would be the preferred option, they must be forced to do so. A few minutes after his offhand treatment of the fact of sewage physically flowing into the unit, the judge gets to the topic of suboptimal care. Having conceded that in a few cases it is accepted that there was suboptimal care, it then says the following, apparently failing to notice that the 2 statements that I'm about to quote are contradictory. I quote report. He said Letby accepted herself that suboptimal care played little or no part in most of the baby's cases. He says defense barrister Benjamin Myers KC repeatedly suggested that doctors had gone out of their way to damage the defendant by blaming her for suboptimal failures in care. He says she did nothing to harm any baby, end quote. I think we can agree that the second statement gives the lie to the first in the sense of raising the very strong inference that the construction is based on disingenuously twisting Miss Letby's words on the stand. Why would Ben Myers be fighting tooth and nail to make the point that his client was only there in the dock as a scapegoat to cover suboptimal failures in care if it wasn't central to the defense strategy? Had his client gone off message under pressure from Johnson KC's questioning, all he would have had to have done was revisit the issue with her on the stand to reiterate the defense position on suboptimal care to the jurors. At this point, Goss's enthusiasm to discredit Miss Letby seems to get the better of him, as, apropos of nothing, he invites the jurors to question her credibility. I quote report. He says it is up to the jury to find who is telling the truth and who is reliable. End report quote. Telling the truth about what? Reliable about what? He has just put words into her mouth entirely consistent with his own summing up position on the instant subject, suboptimal care. The only other explanation is that Ben Myers is the one he's calling a liar here. And I'm pretty sure judicial etiquette does not permit this. The judge now goes on to the subject of insulin. Here, he nails his colours to the mast. I quote report. He says in 2 cases, 2 babies received insulin when it was wholly inappropriate to do so. Each of them, child L, was a twin. He says the prosecution say there is no doubt it was added intentionally. He says the prosecution say the chances of more than one person acting that way, administering insulin, is not realistic. End report quote. For me, this is where he more or less tells jurors Miss Letby is their serial killer for the first time. He's told them categorically that there is an insulin poisoner and, in effect, endorses the prosecution's position that the idea of more than one poisoner is castles in the air thinking. In the context of his unqualified endorsement of the death chart back on June 15th, he is inviting an inference no less obvious than would be a dangled chunk of meat over the nose of a hungry tiger that there is in fact a killer on the unit and the killer is sitting in the dock. To do this, he is treating exogenous insulin as if it was something that has been established forensically or with hard evidence of the spiking of the bags. He's running with it as if it had been established incontrovertibly, but it hadn't. Insulin poisoning was only one of a number of possible explanations, including error, for the results. Even if the results were error-free, there would simply have been a prompt to further investigation. Later, even in giving a reasonably fair and accurate summing up of Miss Letby's career to that point and general perceptions of her, he is unable to resist denying her the full force of her good name in the shape of the good character direction to the jury that she has a legal right to. I quote report. The judge says Letby has no previous convictions. He says it is entirely for the jury to attach the weight of the defendant's previous character. End report quote. Instead of giving the required good character direction, he totally avoids the phrase, simply telling jurors to basically make their own minds up. What he is doing is inviting them to reevaluate Miss Letby's still intact, unblemished character on the strength of the slurs and character smears contrived to buttress a case without evidence or substance, whereas the correct application of the good character principle in a trial would be to direct jurors to balance it against any apparent evidence of bad character. on the basis that a lifetime's behavior patterns give the truth of a person more readily more reliably than any newly minted aspersions on that person's character. This nasty old man was supposed to tell the jurors that they must consider all the mud flung at Miss Letby during the trial in the context of her previously unblemished character, not blithely tell them that it was for them to make of her lack of a criminal record up to that point what they will after 10 months of having her character blackened in their minds. Moving on, later in that same spiel, I was surprised to find Goss mentioning Miss Letby's grievance and giving it its context. I quote, "She was devastated when taken off clinical duties in 2016. She had prided herself on being very competent. Letby registered a grievance in September 2016. It was at that time she learned she was being blamed for the deaths and that was sickening and her mental health deteriorated." End quote. I was surprised because while I note how he said this in a way such that her being taken off clinical duties and the grievance might be unrelated, and he doesn't actually say who the grievance was against, he has explicitly linked it to the case with the mention that it was associated with learning she was being blamed for the deaths. How is this consistent with his ruling out the details of the grievance as inadmissible during the trial? The short answer is that it isn't. Could it be that the reason he didn't want jurors knowing too much about the facts of the grievance during the trial was to protect the credibility of Brearey and Jayaram as witnesses? If the details he reveals in the summing up had been made known to the jurors in autumn 2022, that information is likely to have had some jurors looking at Brearey and Jayaram with new eyes. Their credibility might have been fatally wounded, but with all the evidence now heard, the status of one as head of the unit and the other as the TV doctor had done the required heavy lifting in influencing jurors towards the prosecution's case. The mere theory of guilt as described by Ben Myers in his opening statement. Did the judge reason it was now safe to give jurors fuller information as that information no longer had teeth? He then goes on to give his next legal direction. Apparently, Miss Letby confirmed a defense statement in February 2022, some of which differs from what I understand to be some 30 hours of police interviews 3 to 4 years previously. He doesn't actually say what these differences are, a sure sign that they are negligible and concern peripheral matters like just Facebook activity, or I think someone said in a comment some months ago that what she was wearing at the time of her arrest. This is a prepared statement, so you know that the fault for any discrepancy lies with junior staff back at the solicitors not paying sufficient attention to detail when going over those many hours of interview content in preparing the statement. The woman is on remand in prison and is entitled to rely on her legal team telling her something they are presenting her to sign is a faithful record. This judge knows this and knows that it is unreasonable to expect a person to pick up small errors after such a long time, especially when they have no reason to believe any will be there. Nevertheless, while he gives Ben Myers his entirely reasonable explanation that the errors are down to the delay in bringing the prosecution and the sheer volume of papers, he still exploits the issue to give a direction against her credibility. I quote report. He says, if the jury find a material difference between the two statements, the jury are entitled to ask themselves why. He says if the jury are sure there is a material difference and they do not believe the defendant is telling the truth on the reason for those differences, then that should be in support of the prosecution case. End report quote. He then tells the jurors that they must not convict on the basis of these changes alone. I can never get away from the sense that this last bit being the sense of that last bit being said with something of a nod and a wink, given that literally 15 minutes before he'd spelled it out that there 100% was an insulin poisoner, and it was not realistic to think that more than one person on the unit could be engaged in such activity. Note also that at the commencement of the legal direction, he used the less accusatory term differs, but by the time he gets to his very last utterance in the legal direction, he's using the much stronger word changes. As explained, the use of a word with the connotations of changes is wholly inappropriate. It describes something someone endorsed in good faith, having every reason to believe it to be an accurate representation of historical events she could not be expected to reliably recall. Note he mentions her explanation but does not remind the jury of it. Might the reason be that there is no explanation from her because the discrepancies are so trivial that the prosecution did not even bother putting them to her in cross-examination? I suspect this to be another of several slurs hitherto unknown in my experience of court proceedings in being wholly based on disinformation injected into his summing up by this corrupt but artful man for no other purpose than to seed and continue feeding juror malevolence towards Miss Letby. Yes, I do not like the man, but no, this is not just prejudice. Little more than 30 minutes afterwards, his use of information and the nature of his legal direction are both very different when addressing the same issue in principle, but where exclusively prosecution witnesses are concerned. In that next legal direction, on the appropriate impact on the credibility of a witness of discrepancies in their evidence, first, there are actual discrepancies which had been openly challenged by the defense to refer to, and secondly, the jurors are given the nauseating explanations, the usual politician's mealy-mouthed media speak from the psychopath Jayaram, and the knee-shaking tone of the 10-year-old caught with hands still inside the cookie jar from Dr. Rachel Lambie. Dr. Harkness is also concerned in this. The judge seems to me much more generous and forgiving here, as this legal direction is an invitation to jurors to cut some slack to witnesses embarrassing themselves in this way, whereas the previous legal direction seemed to be encouraging a tightening of the noose around Miss Letby's neck. I quote report. He says that what a witness says in the witness box is all evidence for consideration. He says that where there are or appear to be differences in accounts, it is for the jury to decide how different those accounts are and how important they are, presumably the differences. He says If there are important differences, they should consider them and the explanations given. He says if the jury do not accept their explanations, they should treat the witnesses' evidence with caution. If the explanations are accepted, then the evidence can be treated as such. End report quote. Here we are talking about discrepancies between what people say in the box and accounts which, though they might have been recorded years before, have been constantly in their possession in the interim and are likely to have been reread many times, possibly as recently as earlier the same day. Note also that these are 3 doctors. Therefore, we are not talking about peripheral or trivial matters, but material facts in the so-called medical evidence against Miss Letby. Why such forbearance of witnesses with no real excuse for their more culpable errors on matters of central significance, while holding Miss Letby fully to account for one of no medical significance, which was not even her own, as tacitly acknowledged by her legal counsel? Okay, that covers what I thought worth drawing attention to in what the judge said in his summing up on July 3rd. I'll pick things up on July 4th next time. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments section below. As usual, thank you for watching, thank you for your time, and all the best.